Rolex. Rolex is, of course, the #1 Swiss luxury watchmaker. And I know some of you out there that are major collectors are going to say, excuse me, Patek Philippe. But when we talk about sales, recognition, and the status that Rolex offers worldwide, there is none greater than Rolex. And while 10 years ago, it may have been easier to get pre-owned pieces at a discount or even discounts at the retailer, those of you who are into watches know that getting a Rolex at retail or buying one used is a very tricky challenge, either presenting itself in a way of difficulty with wait lists and prerequisites to get the watch that you want, or paying exorbitant pre-owned fees in the sense of the pre-owns are more expensive than the brand news. But what if I told you that just a short while ago, we're talking maybe 8 years ago, a little bit more than that maybe, this particular model of Rolex no one wanted. This model was trading between $2,000 and $3,000 depending on condition and dial color options and whether it was the stainless steel or the two-tone, etc. But regardless, considering a pre-owned Rolex, even for those days, this was one of those watches that no one wanted. And the serious collectors were writing this off, saying that this was not a real Rolex. Well, that has drastically changed in the last few years. And now, the Rolex Oysterquartz, in this case reference 17014, is getting the respect that it truly deserves by very serious collectors out there. Before we continue, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, it will help this channel grow. Welcome to Tortoise Timepieces, where the time may be slow, but it is always steady. So let's get back into talking about the Rolex Datejust Oysterquartz 17014. Now 17014 represents a stainless steel model with the white gold fluted bezel that Rolex is of course known for with their Datejust models. Talking about this watch, I love the history that is involved with this, because why did Rolex create a quartz watch? And in fact, if you've ever watched a video of how to spate a fake Rolex, probably the first thing that they say is you don't want a Rolex that ticks like a quartz watch. That is the #1 sign that a Rolex is fake, fraudulent, not real. But in this case, Rolex actually did produce this model from the late 70s to 2004. And even before that, there was kind of a precursor to this watch in the 1630, which was an automatic movement, but used the same case as the Oysterquartz used from its inception in the late 70s all the way to its discontinuation in 2004. Again, some more history on this particular piece is that while there are some rumors out there that the piece was designed by Gerald Genta, and we do see a very Audemars Piguet style bracelet in the royal oak that's very similar in the integrated bracelet style that would kind of almost tip your hat to a Genta design. While yes, the Oyster case itself was actually designed by Gerald Genta for the 1630. The 1630 was kind of a poor seller for Rolex, and what Rolex did was they re-engineered this case into the Oysterquartz. But our history doesn't just stop there. We have to go even further back in time to the 60s with the formation of the Swiss CEH group, the Center Electronic Horologer. This included over 20 Swiss watchmakers. Rolex was one of them. Omega, Patek Philippe included as well. Wanted to make sure that the Swiss industry wasn't falling behind when it came to quartz-based movements that the Japanese were pumping out, and wanted to ensure that their watches would still be regarded in such a way that they could sell with the very cheap and very accessible and high quality and accurate Japanese models that were coming to market. This was known as the quartz crisis and is a fascinating tale of history. You can look up a lot of videos on that particular segment of time. But this CEH group came up with a movement, a Swiss movement meant to be used by those who were members of the consortium. This movement is known as the Beta 21 and found its way into Rolex reference 5100, which is a very similar style to the Oysterquartz case, but there were two problems with the Beta 21 movement. First and foremost, that it was incredibly large, and Rolex watches were around 34 to 36 millimeters at the time. it didn't fit into normal Rolex's cases. So the proportions were just so wrong for a Rolex. The second problem presented for Rolex was that they're Rolex. They want to stand above and beyond their competitors, whether that is Patek Philippe or Omega. They don't want to say that the movement in their watches is an Omega movement, because Omega was the first one to use the Beta 21, and I think that the reputation that it gathered was that this was an Omega movement. And Omega and Rolex are kind of like Coke and Pepsi. They're huge competitors of each other. So Rolex did not want to take what would seem like a loss in this regard, using a Omega movement in their watches, because that would signal to their consumers that Omega was the superior watchmaker and Rolex had to use their movements because their movements were not superior to the ones that were used in Omega. So Rolex left the CEH and made their own movement, reference 5035, which is the exact movement that is contained in this particular watch. This example is from 1981, making it a fairly early model of the Oysterquartz. Some of those very early models did not feature the signature Rolex text at 6 o'clock that says superlative chronometer officially certified. Those of you who know that there is an independent certification for Rolexes and for other Swiss watches, making them chronometers. This means that they fall into a certain accuracy and other specs that the industry sets. However, in these very early days, there was really no official chronometer standard for quartz watches because they were so new. So the very, very early examples of the Oysterquartz don't actually feature the superlative chronometer text at 6 o'clock, but this is an example where those standards were finally established and were able to be printed by Rolex. So that's basically the history of this watch. And while unfortunately it never did well in sales, and despite Rolex's marketing campaigns showing that it was taken to Mount Everest and to Greenland and other extreme areas, well, unfortunately, the Swiss watch collector didn't see the value or the reason to buy quartz watches and felt that mechanical movements were more luxurious and more true to the art of horology. Well, that may be true. I do think that the Rolex Oysterquartz 5035 movement and its brothers are much more than your simple quartz movement that was associated with cheap brands like Citizen and Seiko at the time. There were multiple patents that were registered to Rolex in the design of this watch. And I think Rolex really took this as a challenge to make the best possible quartz watch on the market with an accuracy of less than 1 second per day in variation. And even to this day, my 17014 runs at less than 1 second per day in time change. A true testament to the engineering and marvel of what Rolex was doing at this time, and absolutely unheard of in the amount of accuracy time-wise in any movement, whether that was mechanical or quartz for the time. The 1704 stainless steel with the blue face, I do believe, is the most desirable example that is not a day-date version. There was a day-date version of the Oysterquartz as well that featured a fully gold case and bracelet. However, this is stainless steel with only the white gold fluted bezel that we see on many Datejust examples, even to this day in modern Rolex. Did feature the Oysterquartz designation under or above the Datejust, and a sapphire crystal, which was relatively new for Rolex at the time. So let's get into the fit, the finish, and the wearability of this particular piece. And I personally love this watch. This is my first ever luxury watch and my first Rolex at that. So it's extra special to me. Again, a couple of years ago, well, maybe more than a couple of years ago, about 10 years ago, these watches, no one wanted them. They were selling on the secondary market for between $2,000 and $3,000, and that's exactly where I picked up mine. And one of the reasons being was because I wanted a Rolex, but I certainly could not afford one. And on my $13.70 an hour internship that I was working, scrapped together all that money from that summer and went out and bought this particular watch at a nearby jewelry store. Despite being over 50 years old, this watch still has a lot of charm to it and still has a lot of modern hallmarks to the Datejust of today, from the stainless steel steel Jubilee bracelet, and yes, they do consider this a Jubilee bracelet, to the fluted white gold bezel and the sunburst blue dial with, of course, the signature Rolex Cyclops at 3 o'clock for the date. White gold indices, white gold hands, tritium lume, although most of my lume is either non-existent anymore or just plain doesn't work. But screw down crown, 100 meters of water resistance in the signature Oyster case. A beautiful representation of that Oyster case as well. The integrated bracelet style, extraordinarily rare for Rolex, but very, very comfortable. I do believe this watch has been polished once just based on the sharpness of the ends for the integrated case. A wonderful fold over clasp that, again, despite what people call the aluminum foil clasp for Rolex, I think this is very sturdy, and over the last 10 years that I have worn this watch, and this has been my watch almost on an absolute daily basis for the last 10 years, the bracelet holds up incredibly well and does not have a lot of flex to it. It's extraordinarily comfortable and just an absolute beauty on my 7-inch wrist. Able to be adjusted easily for summer and winter temperature adjustments. Just an absolute stunner. 100% Rolex, but honestly could be easily mistaken for the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak with that Gerald Genta inspiration and certainly design from Genta himself for, again, the 1630 in which the case originally appeared on. And this particular piece has adorned the wrists of celebrities, whether it was Tupac or Drake, both of which have been seen wearing this Rolex Oysterquartz. So what do you think? Like I said, 10 years ago, people said, this was the Rolex no one wanted. This wasn't a Rolex for real collectors. Now that has changed dramatically. In 2022, during the height of watch collecting and watch resale prices, these were going for $10,000 to $12,000, but the value has receded like all other models, and now the fair value is between $6,000 and $7,000. Still, quite a mighty hefty premium over what I paid 10 years ago. Is it a great investment? No, because the stock market certainly has returned much better returns, but still, a Rolex that no one wanted? Does such a thing exist in 2024? Will such a thing exist in 2025? I don't know, but I can tell you this. Regardless of the value of this watch, to me, it signifies an amazing time and story in Rolex's very fantastic history, and certainly in the very fantastic history of my watch collection as well. Hope you enjoyed this video. What do you think about the Oysterquartz? What do you think about the future of the Oysterquartz? Will Rolex ever bring this kind of quartz movement back, or this kind of quartz model? People keep saying that Rolex will make a Oysterquartz 2. I kind of highly doubt that, to be honest. But I love this watch. I think it's beautiful. I think this is the best example of it with the blue dial. And I hope that you'll one day get to see a Oysterquartz if you're a serious watch enthusiast. And if you are a serious watch enthusiast, please remember to like and subscribe to Tortoise Timepieces, and I'll see you in the next one.